So, hello everyone, and officially good morning. Welcome to our session for today. We are talking about organizational culture. It's another part of our series where we spotlight different parts of HR, from big functions like employee engagement to specific programs like onboarding. Earlier, we went through some ground rules with our participants. Ground rules are just a great example of setting behaviors that help set the culture for the organization. For today, we are talking all about culture. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I feel like organizational culture is one of the buzziest words in HR and in management. Ang daming nagsasalita tungkol sa culture, but we rarely take a step back to ask ourselves, ano nga ba yun? Or what do we mean by culture? I think we all assume we know what it means, but it can be such a complex topic. So let's dig into that today. It's my favorite topic. So on my birthday week, this is what I'd love to talk about. Let me introduce myself because there are a lot of first timers here with us today. Elisha Corpus Consulting is the firm that you are learning with today. We are a management consulting firm and we specialize in culture transformation, leadership development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have clients here in the Philippines and in different parts of the world as well. For me, I did my undergrad here in the Philippines in UP Diliman, but I actually did my master's in human resources and labor relations in the US. I went to Michigan State University, and these are my classmates in human resources. I specifically focused on HR because I wanted to understand what's happening in organizations. Specifically, how do they form cultures? How do they maintain that? And how do they change that if they desire to do so? I got to apply the things I learned in my master's in Microsoft. After school, I went to Seattle, Washington, lived there for a few years, working with Microsoft in their headquarters. In Microsoft, I was part of the global learning and development team. Very lucky to be there at that time because they were going through a culture transformation globally. It was such a huge effort, and I was lucky enough that the team I was in was directly involved in those efforts. I was creating learning resources, programs, and strategy for 150,000 people around the world. So that's really the kind of scale that I was able to see in terms of culture transformation. Another fun fact about me is I am a lecturer in the most random place, not a doctor, but I lecture to med students in UP College of Medicine. So why do I share that random fact? I share that because that's part of the reason I love talking about culture. A lot of people nowadays, especially the young people, I don't know if you notice, but we can get so disillusioned about work, about organizations, about working for companies. I see it in my friends. Sometimes I see it in myself. And so I love being able to talk about culture because I want people to see that beyond disillusionment, there are a lot of things we can do when it comes to creating the kind of culture we desire. I was so lucky to experience really great work cultures in the US, here in the Philippines as well. And so I love talking about all of those examples and distilling the information that I've learned throughout the years. For today, that's what we are going to be doing. So, specifically, what will we talk about? In this webinar, we will number one, define organizational culture, or at least try to understand the basic principles. I'm going to tell you now, quick disclaimer, hindi ito theory course, okay? If you want like theories, concepts, history of organizational culture, let me know. We can do that some other time. But for today, we really are going to do more of a practitioner's approach to organizational culture. We are going to discuss the relevance of organizational culture to how organizations operate and also identify ways that you too can begin being more intentional about organizational culture in your own companies. So I hope that as we go through our webinar today, we can get to know each other more as we, of course, have these three guides to make our learning smoother. With that, let's begin by kicking it off with our first question for you. In what ways do employees usually talk about culture? Go ahead and you can type your answers on Mentimeter. I put the link there in the chat. And then for people on Facebook, you could also go to www.menti.com and then use the code 78277437. All right, let me now switch over to our Mentimeter and let's see your answers there. Okay. I'm seeing that someone in the chat, you're having issues. You can't see my screen. I am screen sharing and I don't see anyone else with the problem. So maybe you can log out and then try to log back in again. I know it's not the most technical solution, but it works for some people. Okay, the code is 78277437, and you can see that on top of the screen that I'm sharing. Perfect. Okay. If you're having trouble with the Mentimeter, you could also put your comments in the Zoom chat or on Facebook, okay? And it's okay, I can read those comments as well. We use the Mentimeter because some people want to be anonymous, so we give them that option. All right, let's see here. Based on the responses so far, in what ways do employees usually talk about culture? People say it's about employee relations, about engagement. Yes, usually the employee engagement people are the ones involved in a lot of the culture stuff, if you will. Okay. Oh, I love this. Someone got the literal definition. Thinking ahead, we are going to do that later. Okay. Yes, people usually talk about culture before they apply to the company. That's a great call out. Usually, people would ask around, right? Kamusta ba dun? Masaya ba sila dun? Toxic ba dun? And then that's a way for them to decide if they want to apply. They usually talk about it with their coworkers, especially here in the Philippines. It falls under the gossip category. It's funny, the comment, but it's true. Usually we talk about culture casually, whether it's in the pantry or lunchtime, when we're having coffee or milk tea with our colleagues. And I would encourage you maybe to think about it as what's behind that gossip. Diba? Pag meron namang chismis, pwedeng hindi totoo yung chismis. Maybe it's not true, but there's something there that maybe we would want to investigate more around. Okay? During break time, yes. Town hall meetings. So people usually talk about values, expectations, and attitudes. That's great. Norms. Yep. Compensation, part of it as well. Generations, culture champions. It's about the practices of the company. Happy, okay, yes, straightforward, but I see why you would say that. All right, so good, everyone. We ask this question because I want you to put yourself in the context of where you hear about organizational culture. Let's jump back into our presentation and let's discuss those answers that we just saw. In what ways do we usually talk about culture? Sometimes we find this extreme opposite where people who are so happy about how things are going in their company, they talk about how happy they are in that culture. They say that, oh, people are so nice, so friendly, the leaders take care of me. Ganong kultura yung meron dun. But on the opposite side, you also hear people talking about culture when it's so toxic. Pag tinatawagan ako ni boss, 8 p.m. na ng gabi, toxic. Or all my teammates don't support me, toxic, right? So we almost see that when people are so happy or so frustrated, that's when they tend to talk about culture. Sometimes people say that it's simple. It should be something that you're a human, you know how to deal with humans, you know how to be respectful and courteous. It should be that simple. I hear that from some leaders sometimes. Bakit ba kailangan natin mag-training about listening? di ba dapat lahat naman nakikinig? So sometimes people think it's so simple. But also, sometimes people think it has to be complex. So many processes, so many systems all have to integrate together to align with culture and to make that work. And so we almost see that people have different ideas of how hard or how easy, how simple or how complex culture can be. Sometimes people say it's the process, it's the daily things, the daily habits, behaviors that you do. But some people also say it's the outcome. It's the feeling that you feel when you're there. It's what you observe in the daily interactions. And so what we see from these descriptions is culture can be so many things all at once. Sometimes those things that people use to describe culture, it might even contradict themselves, right? Simple, easy, when I'm happy, when I'm sad, process, outcome. So what is it really? It can be so confusing to think about culture. For me personally, I like to think about it as a puzzle. Okay, so why a puzzle? It's a puzzle because ideally, in the ideal situation, you know the big picture. When you're building a puzzle, you have a guide, right? Like you know what picture you're trying to form. Nakasulat dun sa box or sa instructions kung ano yung binubuo mo na puzzle. Ideally, the leaders and the employees are clear and aligned on what that desired culture might be. So then we know what we do to get there. We have the same vision, the same North Star that we're trying to get to. Another way it can be like a puzzle is there are lots of different pieces. Every person contributes to the puzzle. Each person is a puzzle piece. But in organizations, it's not just people that are puzzle pieces. It's also your compensation strategy, your performance management strategy, etc., etc. So all of the systems, processes, people in your organization are pieces that make up that puzzle. Another way organization can be like a puzzle is you need a little bit of trial and error. Think about the last time you had to build a puzzle. You're not always sure where the piece will fit, right? Sinusubukan mo tingnan, dito ba yan? Dito ba yan? Sinusubukan mo kung mag-fit. There's kind of an element of that when it comes to organizational culture. Sometimes leaders will ask me, so what is the process that we need to take to do culture transformation? Or they'll just say, I want culture change in my company. Give me the 3 steps to do. So as a consultant, I tend to avoid just answering those questions directly. Why is that? I want leaders to understand, and I want HR professionals to understand that, yes, we have some models, we have some frameworks, but there's no one sure, clear way to do culture change. It really depends on the organization. It depends on the puzzle pieces that you have and the big picture that you're trying to form. So again, trial and error experimentation is part of the process of culture change and organizational culture in general. That's why I love it. I mentioned that this is one of my favorite concepts to talk about. It's because you always have to be on your feet thinking. You always have to try to figure out what pieces do I have? What is the puzzle I'm trying to build? And how do I make the pieces fit together? It sounds hard, but I think it makes it more exciting and more dynamic. So now, I wonder from your perspective, we have 300 plus people here and more and some more on Facebook. So maybe let me know from your perspective, what makes organizational culture difficult in any way that you can think of, whether it's in the implementation or in your personal experience as an employee. So ano yung mga bagay tungkol sa organizational culture na parang para sa'yo mahirap or challenging yan pakinggan? And you can type your answers in the chat. If you're on Facebook, you can type on Facebook as well. All right, I'm seeing here a lot of people say resistance to change is the hard part. Yup, I would have to agree. I'm going to tell you now, though, yes, we do have some elements of culture change that we'll talk about today, but we're not going to focus on that. I do like separate full days of workshop on culture change, and it's something we cannot possibly discuss at like full length within the time that we have. Although you can apply the things that we will talk about here today. All right. Yep, individual preferences make it hard. Tradition as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll read an answer here. Maintaining the organizational culture is difficult because it depends so much on the personalities of the people involved, which changes per batch or when people leave. To make that even harder, it also changes when leaders leave, right? Leaders can influence the culture so much. And so when we go through like different leaders all the time, it's hard to get to that stability of how should we behave anyway and who's setting that standard. Yep. All right. So what makes it difficult, like what you all said, is we are defining and sometimes redefining that big picture as we go. Change happens all the time. Leaders change, people change, strategies change. And so, as we go through all these changes, we always have to keep culture in mind. We keep the things that we think will still be beneficial to the future of the company, but we want to redefine and change the things or the elements that are not going to be useful anymore. A lot of you said that tradition makes culture change or organizational culture in general difficult. That's part of it. It's very hard to redefine the big picture or what the culture should look like in the future if we are rooted in traditions that are not helping us move forward anymore. So that's probably why you're feeling some of that difficulty when it comes to tradition. Another reason organizational culture is difficult is because we decide on the best fit pieces as best as we can, but we're really not sure, right? When it comes to making decisions on how do I pay people, how do I reward people, how do I promote, how do I hire, etc. We just make the best decisions with the best data or the best information that we have. But at the end of the day, no one can say for sure that this piece will be the perfect fit for this puzzle. So we really are just trying to use the best information that we have in the situation that we find ourselves in. Another thing that makes culture difficult is people don't think experimentation belongs in the workplace. I don't know if you experience this in your organization, but I hear this with a lot of my clients where one of the biggest hurdles for them is encouraging leaders, sometimes even employees, to really just think about how failure and talking about your failure should be acceptable in the organization. We're so trained to think that at work, we have to do everything perfectly, everything right before the boss sees. And so we lose that opportunity to talk about mistakes and to learn from those mistakes as teams. That really hurts culture because culture needs experimentation. Experimentation implies that you fail at some things sometimes, but also you learn from those things. All right. So, really, I think that mindset that we're stuck in sometimes is still hurting us when it comes to culture. In general, if we think about what makes org culture difficult, it's that sometimes people don't even think the puzzle is important enough to talk about. I've heard some HR professionals that I've worked with where their leaders don't even want to talk about culture because they think, oh, that's your problem. That's an HR problem. That's not my problem. Or maybe they'll think, oh, I'd rather focus on just the money versus culture because that's just about feelings. And people should just be more resilient about their feelings, right? These are sentiments that we hear all the time. And so it makes it extra difficult to talk about culture because we're not even in agreement that it's something that's important for organizations. Just keep all of this in mind because this sets up the context for everything that we're going to learn together today. Again, organizational culture can be full of contradictions. Let's dig into what these contradictions might be, why they exist, and what is our culture in the first place. We've talked about why we're here, why it's challenging, the different perceptions people might have. Now let's define it together, okay? So, what is our culture? First, let's look at culture and define that. I have a very long definition in front of me, okay? So here's what we are going to do. I'm going to read it, and as I read it, go ahead and type in the chat a word or a phrase that stands out for you. Okay, let me repeat that. If there's a word or a phrase that stands out for you, go ahead and type it in the chat. All right, here we go. What is culture? Culture is the shared patterns of behaviors, interactions, beliefs, values, symbols, and cognitive constructs that are learned by socialization and that define and distinguish a group of people. All right, go for it and start putting the words or the phrases that stand out for you. All right, I see that on Facebook, someone said individual differences. I got that. Thank you so much. Let's see here. What else are people saying? Okay, Mary Grace. I wonder, would you be able to share a little bit more about why define and distinguish is what stood out for you? Okay lang ba to unmute and maybe we can hear a little bit from you, Mary Grace? Let's see. Mary Grace Valencia, if you're here, would it be
Hi, good
possible?
morning.
Oh, hello, Mary Grace. Ayan, baka you can tell us a little bit more. Bakit yun yung tumatak sa'yo na phrase?
Because there will be a different shared values and all, but that specific culture define a specific group. So, exclusive for that particular company. That's why na-struck ako sa define and distinguish.
Nice. Thank you so much, Mary Grace. Ayan, and thank you for sharing. I love hearing your voices. Ayan, so diba, define and distinguish. Like what Mary Grace said, it's very important because the different cultures that different groups have, it's actually a way for us to know na parte sila nung culture na yan. Or it helps us to also recognize na ka-culture ko yan. So kung pareho kami, baka kagrupo ko siya. Right? So that's why it stands out. All right. Now, I'd love also to hear from, how about, let's see here. How about Lizelle? And Lizelle, are you here? Are you able to unmute? What made the word values stand out for you? Lizelle Angelica, if you're able to unmute. See, let's wait a little bit. Oh, baka hindi. Okay. One last try. Sige, what about Wayne? I wonder, Wayne Simbulan, what made you say that beliefs is what stood out for you? Wayne, are you able to unmute? Hikaya? All right, again, no problem. Maybe later on we can hear from some people there. One last try. I see some people are on video. Maybe we can hear from you because we can see your beautiful faces there. How about see Daisy Ann? And Daisy Ann, are you able to share a little bit about ano yung words that nag-off ng video si Daisy? All right. Don't worry about it, everyone. Sometimes I just like calling people so we can hear a little bit from you and your voices. Sige. So now, this one, just in the chat, okay? I hope I can get a lot of examples from you. What are some examples of unique cultures that you can think of? It doesn't have to be company specific. Think in general, countries, groups, teams, etc. What are some examples of unique cultures? Go ahead, type as many as you can in the chat. Okay. Donna, maybe you can, if we can hear from you, virtual employees, what makes their culture distinct for you?
Hi, everyone. Well, first and foremost, I came from a pre-pandemic company where face-to-face is everything. And then
Mm,
now I'm in a company where majority or 90% of the employees are virtual. It's a totally different culture that I had to learn. It's unique because number one, you don't see them. Number
mm-hmm.
two, they don't some of them don't want to be seen.
Yes.
Number three, even if they don't want to be seen, they want to be engaged, but at the end of the day, they don't come. So that's actually one of the unique things that I'm still trying to understand if it's a norm or is it something that we have to cross over and really make them feel that there is life outside your cubicle at home, that face-to-face engagement is still a key, or maybe it's not anymore the norm. So that's one of the unique cultures that I have seen in my workplace now.
Oh, that's a perfect example. Thank you so much, Donna. And I think a lot of companies are struggling with the same shifts that you're seeing, where people who are virtual are starting to create like a sort of a culture of their own, but the company hasn't figured out yet like what is that culture and how do I deal with that culture. So very, very great example. I'll give you other examples that are easier, everyone. When I say bias, what do you think of? When I say bias, what do you think of? Type it in the chat. Fun answers are okay. Yes, right? K-pop. So nowadays, K-pop culture is so prevalent in the Philippines and everywhere in the world. When you say bias, people are gonna be like, "Oh, anong group? Twice?" And they're coming this Saturday, right? So then that's something I just learned. Like when K-pop was starting to become popular in the Philippines, and I asked, so I was with students talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The first question I had was, can you define bias for me, students? And what they said was Blackpink or BTS. So then I realized, oh my God, oo nga no, that's what they call the people they love in the group that they stan or in the group that they're a fan of. But if you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners, bias for us means unconscious bias. And so that's like a kind of culture that is so unique. I'll give you another example. If I say Super Bowl day, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense for people in the Philippines, right? But Super Bowl days in the US are a big deal. Literally, families would get together in their homes for the whole day. They would just cook like nachos and wings. Yung mga masasarap kainin habang nanonood ng game. And then they gather as a family, sometimes even with friends, to watch the football game. They're even in their costumes, like in the jerseys of the teams that they're in. So that doesn't make sense for us in the Philippines because that's a whole other like sports culture in America. But in the Philippines, if I say Manny Pacquiao game day, lalo na before, di ba, in Manny Pacquiao's like height of boxing supremacy. When I say Manny Pacquiao game day boxing, That means walang kotse sa EDSA, walang traffic, everyone's at home with their families watching Manny Pacquiao. But that probably doesn't make sense to a lot of Americans, or it only started making sense when he started getting popular in the US, right? So these are, even those fun examples can really illustrate what culture means. Think about more of those examples. I saw some here like Catholic, yeah, religion. Religions also have their unique cultures. Schools sometimes will have their unique cultures. So these are things that are easy to distinguish. Again, culture can be material and non-material. What do we mean by that? It could be like for example, it could be my Tumblr is Microsoft branded, so that's like a material example. But it could also be something that's non-material, like a ritual or a belief. It shapes our social relationships. Think about Catholicism. We go to church on Sundays, right? So there are friends that you only see every Sunday because you go to church together. That might be the same for other religions. Culture is performed and reaffirmed by the people who practice that culture. For me, I think this is the most important part to think of about culture. Behaviors persist because we reinforce that in others. Think about it. Bakit tayo nagmamano or nagpopo at opo as part of the Filipino culture? It's because if a child forgets to say po or opo, anong sasabihin ng mom or dad niya? Papagalitan siya, di ba? Sasabihin, magpo ka, mas matanda yan sa'yo. Magmano ka, lola mo yan. Right? So, when people don't do a behavior that we expect, we punish them for it. When people do the behavior, we praise them for it. Ang bait-bait ng bata, nagmamano ka agad, nagpopo at opo. So you get reinforced. That's why culture is made up of behaviors that we as a society reinforce. We are the ones who set those standards. That's why I think this is the most important part to remember about culture. Culture can manifest through the things that you all said on Mentimeter, its norms, its beliefs, languages, events, rituals, traditions, etc., etc. So now, organizational culture, think of the same definition with the slight change that now we are defining and distinguishing members of a specific organization. Okay? I'll give you an example. In the tech world, lalo na before in like the late 90s, early 2000s, during the boom of the tech industry and the different startups, when you say Microsoft employee, that usually means someone more middle-aged. So hindi masyadong bata, hindi masyadong fresh grad, someone who's not so cool. Kasi pati yung suot nila medyo corporate. Versus, think about the stereotype of a Facebook employee. Usually, bata, college graduate, or pwedeng hindi college graduate sometimes, like their founder. Usually, they're wearing slippers, baggy jeans, baka medyo madumi yung t-shirt kasi hindi na sila natutulog. So that's usually the culture that distinguishes the two different companies in that industry. Give me more examples. What if I tell you, describe someone from UP versus someone from Ateneo? Give me the stereotypes. It's okay. No one's gonna get mad. Let me know in the chat. Give me the stereotypical UP versus Ateneo. Yes, slippers versus trainers. Because in UP, diba, we walk so much. It's gonna be so hard if you wear your pretty sandals. Okay, Ateneo graduates, they have a certain tone of voice. Yup, they say that about Povedans as well. So in my high school, I'm Povedan. They say we have the same pitch when we say hi. It gets really high, and then we all sound the same. Okay, someone messaged me, it's Starbucks versus 39 coffee. And so baka may establishments that people tend to go to. Nerd versus social. Yup. Yes, so think about stereotypes like that. These are common beliefs about those cultures that distinguish one organization from another. Okay? So that's just an easy example. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard from some, like, especially in the call center industry, I've heard from some call center employees that they kind of have their own cultures. So they know, "Ah, galing ka dyan, galing ka doon." So they can kind of tell with each other. I also hear it from a lot of like doctors where they'll know, eto, batang to, nag-train to sa hospital na to, or dun sa hospital na yan, because they can kind of see the culture in that person. All right? So again, it's the same way we understand culture, but now with an organization's point of view. So given that, let's talk about some common misconceptions now that we know what org culture is. Number one, I've mentioned this earlier, people think it's an HR thing. It's a misconception though, because it's not true. Everyone is accountable to culture. It's not just HR who will say what you can do or what you cannot do. Yes, HR sometimes implements those policies, but every day, hindi naman nakabantay yung HR mo sa lahat ng sasabihin at gagawin mo, di ba? It's your teammates and your managers who are there surrounding you. So you're the ones who create that culture together. I would even say that it's not an HR thing. Everyone is accountable to it, especially leaders. Leaders have a higher standard of accountability when it comes to culture. That is because we model their behaviors. And so if a leader does something, even if it's wrong, we might think it's right. Think about that, okay? Next is, this is something that only big corporations can invest in, but not small or medium-sized companies. We have this misconception that culture is only something that people with budget can do, or it's something that you only care about when you start working across different cultures or countries. The thing is, all groups have culture. Think about your small barkada, your friend group. Even in your friend group, I'm sure there's something that separates you from your other friend groups in school. So small groups have their unique cultures, which means even if you're a small company, less than 10 employees, it's okay to talk about culture because these things do apply. Another misconception is that there is only one organizational culture. When I talk to leaders, especially the ones who are not as exposed to these kinds of topics, they talk about it almost if they just, oops, there you go. So they talk about it almost as if there's one culture and that's the one goal. They almost try to imagine it as it's all consuming, all encompassing. Na pag nagawa natin to, lahat tayo, ito na yung forever, ganito tayo magbe-behave every single day and every single moment. That's not the case though, because people are different. The environment where the business works also changes all the time. And so there's not one culture that is just stable and steady all the time. If you think about an organization, you have different departments from different fields. So a marketing culture will probably be different from a finance culture, right? Usually your marketing people are more like they're comfortable brainstorming, being creative. Your finance people are more comfortable with policy and following the rules, etc., etc. So even in that organization, different units and departments will have different cultures because the people there are different. And so now what, right? What I usually like to do with organizations is we look at, so what is the foundational culture? It's not the one culture, but it's the foundation within which we are going to build the cultures that we find in the company. We usually start that by defining core culture attributes like your mission, vision, purpose, and your values. If you have those core attributes, it becomes the foundation that others will start basing on. Basta importante, aligned tayo dun sa core na yon. Alright? Next up, another misconception is that culture is the way people are, and thus it cannot change. Ito na yung tradition thing that kept on popping up earlier. Sometimes we say that, oh, we do it because that's the way it's been done in the past 5, 10 years. Ganyan na yan sila, hindi na yan magbabago. Matatanda na yan, matagal na yan dyan, hindi na yan mag-change. I want us to question that because cultures can shift. Cultures are actually quite dynamic, which means that if you put in the work, if you try to reward people differently, if you incentivize people differently for the behaviors that you want to see, it is actually possible to create change. I always like giving the example that I've seen in Microsoft, where maybe like 15 plus years ago, they were known for being such a competitive culture where you have to scream in a meeting for people to recognize that you're smart. You have to be the loudest one banging the table and saying, no, this is what I believe in. But they started realizing that that culture isn't useful for them at all. It was silencing voices of creative people who had creative solutions. And so with the new CEO that came right around the same time I started, which is why it was such perfect timing. So with Satya Nadella, the new CEO, starting 2014, he wanted to change that culture and make it a more empathetic culture. He wanted people to listen more to each other, to consider more opinions and more feedback. We did different things to make that happen. And honestly, even a lot of the skeptics that they were starting to say at that time that they see the change. They were seeing behaviors that are so different from the old Microsoft, quote unquote, as they call it. So I love telling that story because, again, disillusionment is so prevalent these days. And I think the more examples we have of actual change happening, the more we can start believing that these changes are possible. And then, of course, one last misconception is that the goal is to make all employees the same. If this is the goal of the organization, I'm going to tell you now that your culture change initiative will fail. Culture change is not about making everyone the same. It's actually about creating a diverse environment where everyone can feel like, oh, I'm safe here, I can contribute here, because we have a core set of beliefs that's foundational to how we treat each other. Diversity actually strengthens culture. Here's why. Because when people question something, it becomes discussed more. And if it's still important for us, then it becomes reaffirmed. Okay, I'll repeat that. Kapag kine-question natin yung mga behaviors or yung mga ginagawa sa isang grupo, mas napapag-usapan siya at mas na-affirm natin or mas nagde-decide tayo na, importante pala yan. Or, pag nag-decide tayo na ayaw na natin yan, gagawa tayo ng paraan para hindi na siya madala into the future. That's why diversity is important, because diversity enables questioning. When people have different experiences, situations, mindsets, they have different ways of looking at things and more questions arise. If you find yourself in a situation where everyone is forcing you to believe the same things and never question anything, you're in a cult, right? So that's why I love watching true crime documentaries about cults because it's so much like culture, but it's taking that to an extreme where people cannot even think for themselves. Ayaw natin yun sa teams and organizations natin because we want people to think for themselves and give their own ideas. So we want a culture that's diverse and prime for questioning so that we can reaffirm the importance of the different aspects of that culture. All right, these are the 5 different misconceptions about organizational culture, and we are going to talk about why it's important to understand these and some basic steps for culture transformation. But hold on, let me see. I see a comment here. Okay, so there's a comment here that says, what if the company culture is not aligned with my values as a person? How do I survive? All right, very hard question, right? Let's take that right now. So it really depends on your current situation. If you have the privilege or if it's possible for you to move to another company, find different work that's more aligned with your values and with who you are, then that's the best solution, right? But I do understand that not everyone is in that situation. Minsan, hindi option para sa atin umalis. Maybe we need the financial support or whatever. And so, what we can do is we decide now, is it worth it for me to try to change that culture, or will I just decide that I'll be here and I'll just try to survive? It's really about that active choice that you make. If you decide that, okay, it's not worth it for me to help and change that culture, then I would say find pockets of that company where you feel like you can relate with the people around you. Maybe there's a team somewhere or a manager somewhere who's more aligned with your values. Try to find ways to work with them more. Now, if you decide that it's still worth it for you to maybe do something to change that culture of the company, then maybe you can liaise or talk to different leaders, different teams like HR teams in the company, and try to give your ideas for what could be improved. Try to volunteer to help make some of these changes happen or to implement them. It really depends on the situation you're in and the kind of emotional and even time and energy investment that you can make in making that change happen. All right, we can talk about that more later. Let's take it in the Q&A section, but if you have follow-up questions around that, we can talk about it more later. Okay, all right, so let's move on. We talked about the misconceptions, and something I want you to remember from that portion is we have to recognize that org culture and culture in general is dynamic. When changes happen, it's usually turbulent. People question the changes. People feel scared because they cannot make sense of that change. But those are usually opportunities for you to start defining and redefining the desired culture that you want to work towards. All right, so now what? Why do we even talk about it? Bakit importante na naiintindihan natin kung ano nga ba yung organizational culture? That's because culture eats strategy for breakfast. I don't know if you've heard about this, but this is a very common saying or quote in a lot of the management consultant circles. Some people say Peter Drucker, who's the father of modern management, is the one who said it. But honestly, like there are no solid pieces of research that will say he's really the one that quoted this. So let's not quote it with that person. But it's a saying that's been ringing true for a lot of leaders worldwide. So what does that mean? This means that the culture of the company is actually more important than the strategy. It doesn't mean that the strategy isn't important, but what it tells us is you have to pay attention to culture as well. A lot of leaders, they usually just pay attention to strategy. They do planning, operational, strategic, what products, what service, what goods will we offer, etc. But sometimes leaders don't have time to think about how are we treating our people? How are we promoting them? How are we hiring the best talent, etc. Because they think it's not their problem or it's not as big as the other problems. What this quote is telling us is sometimes these culture elements are actually even bigger items than the strategy. A leader has to invest time in thinking about and planning for the culture that they want to see. That's because if we look at organizational design, culture is actually the glue that creates integrated and aligned organizations. What you're seeing in front of you is called the STAR model. It's by J. Galbraith and Kate Kessler. So this shows us the different elements of an organization. We usually use this when we are doing organizational design initiatives. I'll walk you through the different elements of it, okay? It's a star because, do you see that? Like it creates a star and then everything is interconnected. First, there's strategy. Again, strategy is just about ano nga ba gagawin natin? What are we doing in this company to create value for our stakeholders? What product, service are we offering to create the most value that people want and need? That's strategy. That's also talking about how do we create value. So it's also looking at the different offerings and how they make those offerings come to life. Okay. Next up is structure. With structure, you ask yourself, how are we arranged to make that strategy happen? Usually under structure is where you see org charts, right? Who's reporting to who? Is there a separate group for sales and marketing or are they one group? Does it make sense that they're one group? Or is it better for our strategy if they're separated? So these are the kinds of questions that come into play when it comes to structure. Next is processes. Under processes, we ask ourselves, what are the different operational things that we do? And does it make sense in supporting the strategy? What are the different procedures we follow to make the strategy come to life? Okay. Next is reward. So then we ask ourselves, do we compensate people to perform in a way that makes the strategy come to life? Are we promoting the right people who will push that strategy forward? Next is people. So people in general is really more about the people practices that you have. The usual questions here are, do you have the people with the right skills for the roles that will make the strategy come to life? Are you hiring the right people with the right skills, attitudes, motivations to help with your strategy? Okay? So if you want to research more about that, again, it's called the STAR model for org design by just type Galbraith and you'll find it, okay? When we are understanding these elements, we cannot forget that culture is at the center of it all. Again, that's because culture is kind of the glue that will integrate everything. The way people behave, what the company believes in, it's all related to culture. For example, what if we say that as a company, our part of our strategy is we want to cater to a wide range of, let's just say, a wide range of customers. We want everyone, young, old, different genders, different attitudes, different situations in life. So let's say that's the strategy. But what if in terms of people, the company says, ay ayoko mag-hire ng ayoko mag-hire kapag gay. So then, where's the alignment there, right? How can you say that your strategy is to make products for everyone when the people part is not aligned with being inclusive and welcoming? So that's really why culture as the glue matters, because everything has to be aligned. Employees need to see that consistency. All right. There are times when, as employees, we just feel like there's something wrong, but I don't know what's wrong. Yung parang hindi lang ako masaya dito, pero di ko alam bakit. Usually, it's because there's a misalignment somewhere. And part of helping solve that is to identify those misalignments. That's why I love this model, because sometimes what I like to do is I just show it to the person and say, okay, if you look at these different elements, where do you think is the misalignment happening that's making you frustrated? And so then it's easier for them to understand na, dito pala yun. So now I know. All right. So what is this telling us? I want you to remember that org culture is the glue that creates integrated and aligned organizations. We've been talking about integration and alignment since the very first HR spotlight. So I want you to always remember that your role as HR people is spotting those areas where integration and alignment do not happen and finding ways to make them happen. That's why we talk about org culture. It's very, very important for companies to have that. I didn't go through statistics on how companies with strong cultures have more engagement or more retention, etc., because those are so easy to find online, honestly. If you just type benefits of strong culture to employee engagement, you'll immediately see hits there on Google or on Bing or wherever. But beyond those statistics, this idea that you're seeing on the slide is what I hope you can always remember. All right. So now we get to the exciting part. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, so paano? How do I work on our organizational culture? What are some things that I can do to make that happen? I'm going to show you the phases of culture transformation that I use with my clients. I'm going to tell you now, though, that this is something we use for our consulting work. That's why if you see medyo watermarked yung slides, and if you type it online, you're going to find many different versions, okay? As with all the frameworks that we have, take what works for you and your company. This may not be what applies, but try to get the intent that you can apply for your own situations. Number one, it's important to understand the current reality. We usually do org diagnosis, we do surveys, we do focus group discussions, interviews to try to get an understanding of how are employees perceiving the companies in terms of those elements of the STAR model that we talked about earlier. Remember, diba? Strategy, structure, processes, people, rewards. We dig into all of those and try to see what is currently happening now. Do you have the right strategy to target the people that you want to target? Do you have the right processes that enable your employees to work smoother and better? So these are the kinds of questions you want to understand when it comes to your current reality. Data is very important here. So the more you are comfortable with using data, the more your decisions will, at least it'll be more sound, right? Because you're basing it on actual data that you've gathered. There's a question here about free climate surveys or satisfaction surveys. There might be some free ones. So for example, if you look for, I'll type it in the chat. If you look for, Gallup's Q12, for example, That's 12 questions from Gallup about employee engagement. And if you look for it online, you can find it there. I will caution you though, not all of the free ones are immediately applicable. Very real experience I've had recently where I took over a project from another I took over a project of a company, and they used Gallup's Q12, which is just about engagement, to measure overall culture. And so it gave them a distorted picture, right? My caution here is really be careful, read about ano ba yung mini-measure ng survey na to before you apply it to anything, because it might not give you the full picture, okay? Another thing to think about is do not discount qualitative data. What do I mean by that? A lot of leaders will think that numbers would be what's important. Kaya tayo nagpapasurvey kasi gusto natin average, mean, etc. But getting anecdotes, getting phrases, words, paragraphs of explanations through interviews or focus group discussions, those are also very important. Okay. So don't let the, not having access to surveys, don't let that stop you. If all you can do is have interviews or focus group discussions, that's okay also, because you can get a lot of rich data from that. All right. Next up, number 2. Now we have to define the cultural attributes. Here's what's hard about this. Most companies already have mission, vision, and values, right? But every when do you revisit those mission, vision, and values? Usually just during onboarding. It's only your new hires on the first day na nakikita nila yung attributes na yon. What I encourage you to think about is, how do I make those attributes visible all the time to all employees, not just to my new hires? So what we usually do when we have projects with clients is we get all the leaders and different representatives from sectors of the company together, and we look at the mission, vision, values. We ask, are these still applicable to the future that you want to create? If not, let's revise it. Let's look at the data you have to be able to revise that into something that's easier to understand, something that feels more real. And then, once we have that defined, we try to look at what can we do to make this more visible and easily accessible. A lot of it is on the leaders, because I really try to make sure that they talk about it as much as they can. When leaders make speeches, we coach them to be able to insert the mission, vision, and values there. The pushback I usually get is, it sounds so cheesy, ma'am. Bakit ganon? But I want leaders to be comfortable doing that, because if they're not comfortable talking about mission, vision, values, paano pa yung employees? How can you expect employees to talk about it when the leaders themselves don't, right? All right. Next up, number 3, identifying people involved and securing leadership sponsorship. A lot of HR people, I think this is where they have a hard time. Leaders, sometimes they think, once I'm done with the workshop and we've revised the mission, vision, values, done. That's culture change. But no, because there are many, many more steps. And so what I encourage HR people to do is to really be real with your leaders. Tell them, boss, malaking trabaho to. Kahit tapos na yung workshop, ang dami pa nating gagawin. Are you okay with that? Do you commit to doing that? Because they have to be all in making that culture change happen. You have to find like a working group, technical working group, or maybe there's a group within HR. Or my recommendation is try to have a group with different people who represent different functions, and you're all working together to continue that culture transformation project. It's very important that there are people dedicated to thinking about it and implementing it. Next up is number 4. You can target moments that matter in the employee life cycle. What are moments that matter? I'm sure with some context, you know what I mean. Maybe you could type it in the chat. What are moments that matter in an employee's life cycle? So, sa buhay ng isang empleyado, ano yung mga moment na importante para sa kanila in that work life? Yup, work anniversary, good one. Promotions, especially getting promoted from hindi manager to manager, right? New manager. Day offs could be sometimes, diba? Because if it's a reward or if it's a big day off, sometimes some companies reward people with trips, right? So that's kind of a big day off if you think about it. It's a moment that matters. Salary increase, especially if you jump bands. Yes, that's very important. Christmas parties, lalo na yung mga new hire na pinapasayaw. Okay, I see that. All right. Okay, so good. We all intuitively know what moments that matter are. Now, moments that matter are important kasi tumatatak siya sa isip mo. Kaya it was so easy for you to give me examples kasi tumatak siya sa isip mo. We infuse culture there because you want culture to also be something that sticks to people's minds. One of my big projects when I was in Microsoft is new employee onboarding. And so as we do new employee onboarding, we try to find ways to already teach them about what are the culture attributes, how do we define these behaviors in the company. Because as early as that, they're more primed to think about what those behaviors are and to actually try to apply them. Okay, so again, moments that matter, we target that to infuse culture there. Next is number 5, communicating through storytelling. When I do workshops on culture transformation, I always ask people, what do you think is the most important tool in culture transformation? Sometimes leaders will say data. So very important that you have good surveys, good like learning management systems, good employee like HRIS systems that you have to collect information. Some people will say budget. Budget is the most important tool. Pwede naman. But honestly, the most important tool is storytelling. Storytelling is the simplest but most powerful way of sharing and teaching behaviors, values, and beliefs. In almost every culture, if not all in the world, we know of how tribes would sit with elders, maybe there's a fireplace, and then they talk about, ito yung pinapaniwalaan natin sa tribe na to or sa grupong ito. And that's how the young people grow up believing what they believe. So think about that. When we tell powerful stories, it can change minds and hearts and convince people of the change that you're trying to make. A lot of times, culture change can be faced with a lot of skepticism. You'll get a lot of pushback, especially in the beginning when people will say, yan na naman sila, bago na naman. Wala namang use yung pinapagsasabi nila, diba? So that's very common. But we use stories to start shifting those mindsets. Stories are most powerful if you have specific people that you can use as examples. Zappos, maybe I don't know if you've heard of them, but a few years ago, maybe like 10 plus years ago, that's one of the most famous companies that will always get used when it comes to customer focus. So what is Zappos? Zappos is a company in the US, and what they do is they are an online platform. Think of Lazada. Maybe that's the closest thing I can think of. Think of a Lazada, but they are specialized in shoes. Okay, following so far? So they sell shoes online, which means they have customer service representatives who answer calls with complaints. there's this one famous story of a customer service representative who stayed on a call with a person, with a customer. I think it was like 13 hours or something like that. Like a really, really, really long call with one customer. So bakit? Because the company instructs their customer service representatives to see the human at the end of the line. They always say, talk to them, understand their needs so we can help them. So it turns out na nung tumawag siya, marami siyang pinapagdaanan. Like it was a customer na hindi, yung nangyari sa kanya sa sapatos, tip of the iceberg lang. Pero super, super daming problems nung tao na yun. And they got comfortable talking. That's why the customer representative of Zappos just continued showing empathy to talk to the person. Instead of getting mad at that person, they even featured him in a lot of videos about Zappos. That's the kind of storytelling we want to see. It's a little bit theatrical if you think about it, but think about the last time you watched like a really good play or musical, right? You remember it because it engages all your senses. So that's what we want to do by storytelling. Number 6, institutionalizing desired behaviors. When we say institutionalizing, what we mean is you want to actually make that part of your systems and your processes para lahat sila aligned. For example, if you say that collaboration is part of your culture, but what if you incentivize teams within your company through competition? Yung pinakamataas lang na sales ang bibigyan ng bonus. I don't care if you sabotage other teams or steal their customers. Basta pataasan lang tayo. So then you're not institutionalizing your desired behavior of collaboration. Okay? So again, institutionalizing desired behaviors means we change the processes and policies to be aligned with the culture we want to see. And of course, the last one is 7, measuring progress. Data is constant when it comes to culture change. It's actually sometimes quite funny when people say that culture change is all like emotions and heart and feelings. Because if you look at the amount of data we have to process in culture change, it's crazy. So really think about how you constantly measure progress. For example, a concrete thing that you can think of is instead of just one annual big culture survey or employee satisfaction survey, what if you also have smaller surveys, shorter, and in pulses? So we call them pulse surveys. Parang SWS yun, di ba? You hear that sometimes in the news when they do pulse surveys. That means these are smaller scale surveys with smaller groups of people just to gauge the sentiment. So you can do that maybe every quarter in different months just to see how you're doing with culture change. It's not always exact step by step, but these are just some ideas for you to think about if you want to start being more intentional about culture change. The main lesson here is building your organizational culture should be an intentional choice, okay? It doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't just, if your leader says, magiging collaborative yung culture natin, nothing's gonna happen if it's all just the words, right? You need a lot of intention, a lot of action and planning to make that change happen. So now, everyone, that is it. That's the end of the things that we are going to learn today. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the next few minutes, okay? So how we usually do our webinars is we recap, we do a review of everything we've talked about so far. I give you instructions, especially for certificates. And then if you need to go at 11:30, you can go ahead and enjoy, go to lunch na, early lunch. But if you have some more questions, I usually stay until whenever. So that's how we do it, because I know some people, they don't have questions anyway. So they can just go and you can have your time back. All right. So now let's start synthesizing, everyone. Anong babaunin nyo from today? All right, what insight will you take home with you from today's session? And please type that in the chat, a phrase, a word, or a sentence. Anong babalutin nyo para i-take home from our webinar for today? All right, thank you. Culture is not changed overnight. It takes a village. Yes, exactly. Org culture is an intentional choice. Yep, you have to decide every day that culture change is still worth it, because honestly, there will come a time when you will say, hala, walang nangyayari, or bakit ko ba to ginagawa? So the team will really have to make that conscious effort that, okay, this is worth it. This is something we want to do. Yep, culture is broad, exactly. Yep, it eats strategy for breakfast. It's not just an HR thing, perfect. It needs effort and teamwork. It has a big impact in organizations. Very important, yes? You should get the buy-in of the leaders, exactly. Oh, I love that. Qualitative data is just as important as quantitative. Perfect. All right, everyone. Thank you for your baon and for your take homes that you are typing there in the chat. So in these webinars, very, very encouraged to Sharon all the time, okay? You always need to have baon before you leave, okay? So now, to synthesize all of that, let's say goodbye to Sharon there. Remember that number one, org culture is dynamic. It changes. And so we have to redefine and define things together as we go through those changes. Org culture is a glue that creates integrated and aligned organizations. We talked about the STAR model: strategy, structure, process, reward, people. Culture is the glue that will align all of those structures. And then, of course, the last thing is building organizational culture should be an intentional choice. It's something that you really have to commit to, and it's not just HR that commits to it, right? Everyone in the organization will have to affirm that this is something that's worth it for us and the future we want to build. Think about it like a puzzle. A puzzle because ideally we know the big picture. If you think about the phases of culture transformation, we said that part of it is defining your cultural attributes. That's what we mean by the big picture. Dapat alam mo kung saan yung gusto nating puntahan as an organization. There's lots of different pieces. We've been repeating that all the time. And each person, each employee is their own piece that they're bringing to the table. And then, of course, trial and error, that's very much required. Experimentation is part of culture change, and it's something that change won't exist without that experimentation. So I do hope that with the things we talked about today, it's hard to think about culture, but I hope you also see how fun it can be. It can be so fulfilling to experiment and to think about building something that will last, building a culture that will help people behave with each other, building a culture that will help people create safety for each other. I think that can be such a fulfilling thing to think of if you work as part of that, whether directly or indirectly, whether you're an HR person actually heading up these things, or if you're an employee and you're involved or you're helping. I do hope that learning more about culture is something that encourages you to see how exciting and fulfilling this part of HR can be. So with that, everyone, Very quickly, let's go through what to expect next. Please do connect with us on Facebook or on LinkedIn. We'd love to see more of you and get to know more of you. For certificates, please request for a certificate by answering the evaluation form. I put the link over there in the chat. So it's tinyurl.com/hrspot-org culture. So the form will be open for 2 hours only, and certificates will be given again within 1 week. Next up, please stay tuned for the next set of webinars. We're skipping October because I have a lot of lectures that I need to do with those med students that you saw in the picture earlier in October. So October will be pretty busy. Oh, okay, hold on. Let me see. People are blocked. Hold on. Let me check that again. Wait up. Okay. If the tiny URL is malfunctioning, hold on. Let me do one quick check. And then I'll give you a separate alternative link if ever. So could people please check? All right, I think some people are able to access and for some, they're not able to access. Like what Vanessa suggested, refresh, or it might be because some of you are at work and your company is blocking it. If ever that's the case, I have the direct Google form link also in the chat. So see if that works, please. And if ever tiny URL is not working, again, try the direct Google link in the chat. Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, October, no free webinar, but November is when we will have our work as one. It's kind of like a virtual conference that we've been doing since 2020. So we are on year 4. No, since 29. Yeah, 2020. So this is now year 4 of the mini conference that we do. And what it's about is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we have a series of different webinars with different speakers, different expertise, and it's all about creating an inclusive environment. We usually have it in October. I don't know for those who remember, but again, October is going to be just crazy busy. And I think November gives everyone more breathing room because after the holidays, right? The long holidays, at least you're energized, you're refreshed, and we can learn together again. Okay? So please, again, tiny URL is there, or do the Google Forms if the tiny URL doesn't work. And everyone, that is it. Thank you for learning with me today. Thank you for all your comments and your questions. We talked about organizational culture today. Very complex topic, but also can be quite fulfilling. So at this point, if you do not have any questions, I'll give you your time back. It's 11:30. You have 30 more minutes before lunch, or enjoy your early lunch. And then for people with questions, I know there was one question I skipped earlier. I'm going to stay until we finish all of those questions. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. If you have questions, you could start typing them in the chat. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the link to the evaluation again with the Google form link. Hold on. So in case your company blocks tiny URL, at least you have these. Okay. There you go. All right, everyone. So you can click either the tiny URL or the Google form and test those. If it's not working for you, you can refresh. I've seen some people say here that refreshing works. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that. Let me address the question I skipped earlier, okay? Okay, so the question was, how do we change culture if top management does not like spending too much time doing socialization and engagement activities because it's quote unquote unproductive, but the top management person wants to shape the culture in the organization. SOS. Okay, very hard question, but I'm going to tell you now that you're not alone. This is actually a very common problem that we hear about in organizations. Leaders will usually say that they want to shape the culture, but they don't really want to invest in it because they think it's unproductive. So there are different ways to approach it, but maybe as an HR person, one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to think about first is what are the activities that you are putting forward? Ano ba yung mga sinasuggest mo dun sa organization? Because what if the leader just doesn't see how it's aligned with the strategy? So maybe as the HR person, what I would usually do is first take a step back, really try to understand what's our business strategy. Increase your business acumen so you understand that. You understand how this company makes money. From there, look at the gaps. What is happening with my people in the organization that's making it challenging to implement that strategy? Usually, you do like a learning needs analysis that could help you look at gaps in competencies, for example. That's one of the easiest things you can do. Once you know the gap that's stopping people from making the strategy happen, that's what I will address first. So, for instance, what if the gap is managers don't give feedback? Maybe they don't know how, they don't have the skill. So, what I'll do is I'm going to tell the leader that what we want to propose as an activity is to teach the managers how to give feedback because that's what's blocking them from implementing the strategy. Really show that line of sight so that your leader can see how that activity is helping with the ultimate goal, which is part of the strategy. It's a little bit harder because we assume, right, that if people say culture is important, they understand what needs to be done. But sometimes you need to be that explicit about why the activities make sense and why you're doing it. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing is try to have I don't want to say a strategic approach to culture change, but really look at it from a holistic perspective. So I don't know your situation, but there are times when I hear from HR professionals that what they do for culture change is just like team building or, like fun engagement activities. Those are okay. They're good to have, they're fun, but maybe the challenge is how can you have a more holistic point of view of culture change where it's not just about team building or the fun engagement activities? Also show your leaders that data is part of it. Do you have the data or the employee information that will tell you what's useful for the culture? Think about things like that so you can show the leader that the initiatives you're putting forward are actually productive ones that are not just about like fun and socialization and engagement. All right? So hopefully that helps kind of set the tone for the things that you can do to convince your leader in the future. Okay, I have newer questions here. Let's address the questions. Okay. Next question is how can we change a culture of a team that is full of bias, nepotism, unfair treatment, unfair promotion, and all? Okay, very big question. What I would do first is when I usually hear about things like this, number one, I try to see, so do you have a performance management system in place? Paano ba yung mga tao binibigyan ng feedback about their work? Paano ba pinopromote yung mga tao? Do managers talk to their employees about their performance? Is that something that the company requires managers to do? Tuwing kailan? once a year, every quarter, etc. So I try to find out what is currently happening. And then next, I want to talk to leaders. So really asking leaders, what's your ideal scenario of how people manage performance, especially how managers do that performance management. Because from there, we want to understand kung ano ba yung point of view ng leader. If the leader doesn't change the way they manage their own people, then it's very, very highly likely that your lower level managers will not change their behaviors as well. So I want to start talking to that leader because you know what? What if for them that's the culture they want, right? Who I don't want to say like that's the ideal culture, but what if for the leader, for them it's no, you know what? I want closeness to be the thing, right? If I know you more, mas trust kita. I value that trust more than your performance. Extreme example, but what if that's what they're thinking of? That's why it's okay for them to promote based on how close someone is to someone. So then now you know that that's the mindset of the leader, right? And you have two options. One is if that's the culture they want to create and it's not aligned with what you think should be done, then maybe it's not a good fit for you anymore. And if it's possible, you can move to a different company. But what if you want to convince them that that's not the most productive thing for the company? Then you start with that whole culture change process that we talked about earlier. Gather data talking about how the nepotism, bias, unfair treatment is hurting everyone. Look at data on maybe ilan ba yung mga tao na high potential, yung mga pwede sila i-promote, pero umalis sila bago pa sila ma-promote. That's very telling, di ba? So then look at what did they say in their exit interviews about their reason for leaving. So then you can make that an argument for people feel like they're not being promoted fairly in the company. They're not being developed if they have potential. Gather the data that you need because you need to show your leaders that the current environment is hurting the company in a very tangible way. So again, a lot of different options and different things that you can do. But to summarize, number one, get a lay of the land. What is currently happening in terms of performance management? Number two, talk to the leaders and get their thoughts and their feelings on that kind of management of performance. What do they think is right or should be done? And number three, go ahead and gather the data that you have to be able to show how this kind of culture may be hurting the company tangibly. All right, hopefully that helps. Let's go to the next question. Okay, next question is, how do I revive a dying organization? It's a nonprofit. Okay, we're really struggling to sustain active volunteers. I love this question because I actually work with a nonprofit and it's all volunteer based, no full-time employees. It's called 2KK, Tulong sa Kapwa Kapatid. And what we do is we provide scholarships for kids in Smoky Mountain, Sampaloc, and Payatas. But also beyond scholarships, it's about leadership development, really helping these kids to get the skills so they can be leaders in their own communities. Like, for example, the SK chairman of Payatas now was a 2KK scholar since like they were super, super young. So that's the kind of leadership we want to develop. And I love the question because this was kind of a problem they faced as well when I started volunteering with them as one of their consultants. So the first thing we really did was revisit ano nga ba yung ginagawa natin dito? So what is this organization for, right? Like, what value do we provide to the communities where we operate? And so from there, we went through a lot of discussions about the mission, vision, and the values of the organization. In the past, they had a lot of different activities. Like, you all, if you see the calendar of this organization, you are not going to believe how they have time for all of it. Like, just people are quite tired because they have so much going on. And so what we did was we clarified what is the purpose of the organization. For 2KK, we realized that it was really to develop leaders in those communities so they can give back to the communities in a sustainable and empowering way. Once we solidified on that purpose, we were able to identify what activities are so important that the organization will fail and die if we don't do them. Kailangan yung prioritization, because once you prioritize your activities and initiatives, then you can also understand what kinds of volunteers do I need for these priority activities. For us, we realized that we really wanted, for example, like workshops, leadership workshops for these kids. And so the volunteers that we needed are people with skills who can teach that. So for that time period, we really doubled down on making that happen. We also realized that like social media presence was so important. So we looked for volunteers with that skill set in marketing, creating graphics, publicity materials, etc. Once we got smarter on the skills that we need for our volunteers, we were able to target that more. So the shift in mindset was about we don't really need 100 volunteers who have general things to offer. What we need are maybe just 20 volunteers with the specific skills that will be most helpful to the organization. So that's kind of how it helped us to continue still thriving until now. 2KK just celebrated their 20 years actually this year. And it's funny because now that we're even more focused about what activities are important, we have more volunteers who really want to get involved. I think when you're clear about those priorities, people will see it and that encourages them to also join up and attend. Okay, next up, that got a bit long because I love 2KK and I do work with nonprofits as well sometimes. Okay. Hmm. I have a side comment here, but I think it's good to mention. So the comment is, what if we have the buy-in of leaders and the CEO likes the idea of culture change, but doesn't like to spend time, money, or manpower on it? Then as a consultant, if I were talking to your leader, my comment would be, sure bang, may buy-in, may buy-in ako sa'yo. Parang, because, buy-in without actually giving resources to a project is just lip service. That's just words, right? So maybe when it comes to these leaders, you need to have the talk. You need to have the talk about like, okay, is this still really important for us? Because honestly, if it's not important for you now, if it's not something we can provide resources for, then we can table it. Baka naman may ibang bagay na dapat ginagawa ko kaysa ito, di ba? So, I think in those scenarios, it's time for that talk, right? Where people are just being honest about what is it really that we can invest in and what's something that maybe we'll invest in next year or 2 years from now. Rhea, I see your hand raised. Let me know what you need. How can I help you? Let's ask Rhea first and then get back to questions in the chat. All right. Rhea, okay, I will lower your hand. There you go. Okay. Next question. How do I create a culture in an organization that is full of employees that are very vocal on their opposition to change? Okay. A lot of this we can talk about more. Maybe we can do like change management in our next series of webinars. Let's see. Okay, so basic answer is number 1, engage with them even more. The tendency is when employees are upset, ayaw natin sila kausapin, di ba? That's very real because it's so hard to talk to people who are upset. It's upsetting to talk to people who are upset. But the challenge here is when people are vocal about their opposition, engage with them more to ask them why. What is it about what we're currently doing that you're opposed to? When we do that, we can understand better and find opportunities that we can maybe develop or improve more. The great thing about people who are vocal is alam mo kung anong kino-complain nila. It's harder if they're not vocal and they are disengaged because you're not able to guess what's going on in their heads, right? So maybe see it as an opportunity first that people are vocal about their opposition. Next, try to create small wins. Given the culture, given the culture change initiative, try to think about what are some easy things that I can change or that I can implement. For example, what if people are needing like better structure to better structure to talk to their peers about their feedback. So peer-to-peer feedback, constructive criticism. Let's say, for example, that's one of the skills they're looking for. A quick win would be providing them with a flow. This is how you give feedback. 5 steps that you can use in your next conversation. Find people, number 3, find people who have used that quick win. Use their story as an example of how to apply those things. So then, what you're starting to do here is giving people little pieces of things that are going right or going well as proof of concept. You kind of want to show that it works, even in a small scale. What you also want to do is once you have those quick wins, get stories that you can tell to reinforce those quick wins. Because again, storytelling is the most important tool in culture building. Okay? It's just some quick steps that you can try, but hopefully that will help get your first step as you deal with your vocal opposition. Next up, how do I get support from a leader that doesn't see the value of culture change, especially the leader doesn't give time to hear our needs in the HR department? It's kind of related to the questions that we answered earlier, but I think yours is a bit more general in the sense that it sounds like even the credibility of HR as a business partner is not something that your leader is seeing, right? Um, in these cases, what I encourage you to do is find ways for HR to be a credible and essential partner to the business. Try to learn about ano ba yung ginagawa namin dito and paano makakatulong yung HR dun sa ginagawa namin dito. The reality is, probably the first thing that you will do is not yet directly related to culture change. Maybe there's a process that's broken in your company. Maybe there are people in conflict that you will need to help solve. Look at those problems that are currently going on in the company. Maybe you think they're not related to culture change just yet, and that's okay. Solve those first, gain credibility as an HR business partner so that your leader will see na, marami palang benefit na nakaka-work ko yung HR. Or, you know what? Now I see why there's an HR in the company. I think that's my read from your question kasi your leader still needs to see that HR is an important part before they start to believe that culture change is something they can work with HR. So look for those opportunities where your HR credibility can come into play. All right, next up, give me suggestions, please, on how to transition from a traditional culture to one that aligns with the preferences and values of Gen Z. Interesting question. Okay, I get this a lot, but maybe my challenge for you here is to take a step back. sometimes it's really not just about the Gen Z and the preferences and values of Gen Z. What do I mean by that? There are studies, for example, that will show Gen Zs are similar to Gen Xers when it comes to how they prioritize stability and financial security. You can look up what is that name? It's the Deloitte annual Gen Z and Millennial survey. I think they've mentioned it there. There's also a study from Accenture on Gen Zs that mentioned that. And now that you know these data, these points of data, it makes you think, right? That the things that you implement in a company isn't just for a specific generation. There are things you can do that are beneficial and positively received by people from all generations. And so maybe what you can do is take a step back and try to see, what do my employees want? What are the things that they're looking for that will enable them to thrive in the workplace that they're in, whether they're Gen Z, millennial, boomer, whatever that might be. I think what you'll find is that it really depends on personalization. A lot of it is about what life stage is the person in. Because regardless if you're millennial or Gen Z, for example, a single childless person like me will have different needs from another millennial who maybe has a family and one child, right? So those kinds of personalizations occur within generations. That's why I think it's so important that we don't get so much into the generational aspect of it, but look more at what do the employees need and want? How can I provide that from a company perspective? How can I use that knowledge to define the kind of culture that will help us move into the future? What behaviors will allow these employees to be aligned with that future culture that we want to see? So I think these are the things that maybe you'd want to ask before getting into more like gender or sorry, generational focused kinds of discussions. So hopefully that kind of helps zoom out a little bit. Okay, lots of questions, everyone, but it's okay. If you need to go, go for it. Go have your lunch. I'll stay here and I'll answer the questions. Okay. Next up. So the question is, what if the immediate supervisor or like the manager is the one who's not into activities and doesn't accept evaluation from the team members? Okay, so in these instances, number one, HR will be your best friend. Look up who is your HR business partner for that team or that department, and they really are the ones who have to be helping you get the message across to that leader. That's one option. The next thing is, if you're a part of that team and it's really like something that is not helping you do your best work or enjoy the environment that you're in, you have to find a way to give that feedback to your leader. There are different ways to give feedback in an effective way. And the most effective way when it comes to managers is to really sit down with them one on one, ideally in person, have that conversation. The way I give feedback is first, be specific about the behavior. Really tell them, nung Tuesday, sinabi mo to sa meeting na to. So be specific about what it is that's not helping the team. And then talk about how it's affecting you and try to get the perspective or the point of view of your manager so you also understand where they're coming from. You leave that conversation with some actions or commitments that maybe the manager can do and that you can support with. It's a little bit harder to do that because we're not used to being a subordinate giving feedback to the manager. But if it's really something that matters and you feel like, okay, it's time for me to step up and do it, maybe that's something you can do as well. The other option is, if the other two options don't work, you have to talk to the leader of that superior. So think about the boss of that boss. How can you give them feedback about the leaders who they have to manage? Because in reality, yung boss nila, mabibigyan sila ng feedback tungkol sa kung paano sila mag-manage. So maybe you can consider that as well. The hard part there is your manager will feel like you went above them, right? And it's not a comfortable position to be in. That's why my initial suggestion really is either do HR or talk to the manager muna. Either you or bring a teammate with you. All right. Thank you, everyone. For people linked to certificates, you're still asking for the link to certificates. Hold on. Let me copy that for you. And then again, for those who have no other questions, feel free to go and take your lunch. And now I'm going to answer more questions. Okay. Just making sure I didn't miss anything here, okay? Next up, what if an individual started to question the team culture, yet the team response was to create a cohort to make the particular individual disengage? How can I help the person deal with this kind of conflict? Okay. I'm assuming that maybe you're like an HR person or someone outside of the team giving advice to that person, right? It sounds like it is. Okay. So what advice would I give? Number one, maybe I would ask the person, maybe tell me more. How did you question the team culture? Kwento ka, di ba? Ano yung, ano yung situation? Kailan mo siya bringing up? Kanino mo siya unang bringing up? Sino yung mga kasama dun sa room nung pinag-usapan nyo yun? I ask that because I'd love to understand the context. When it comes to giving feedback, we really have to set the right context. And tingnan natin, di ba? Baka hindi lang tama yung context or yung situation kung kailan bringing up niya yung mga items about culture that they want to question. So maybe that's one of the first things I would love to find out. Number two, what I'm going to ask is now, ano yung question mo about the team culture? Maybe what is that concern that you have that you brought up with them? So I ask that because if you know the concern, maybe there are different ways to go about who to approach to help you. If it's something that you think maybe my HR person or another leader can help me with, then at least now you're identifying, right? Who do I go to and who can I ask for support? And then the other thing is, when it comes to these instances, if that person is really feeling like they're being excluded because of the concern that they brought up, the next challenge is to talk to the teammates about how they're feeling giving that exclusion. So pwedeng i-sit down nila yung manager nung team nila and really say, manager, ever since I brought up that issue about the team culture, I've started noticing na medyo hindi na ako sinasama ng mga tao. And the impact that has on me is I feel as if I was excluded because of the comment that I made. I just want to tell you about that because I want to have a good relationship with you and my teammates. Reiterate your intent, di ba? Bakit mo ginagawa to? Kasi gusto mo sila makatrabaho ng mas maayos pa. Gusto mo maging good yung relationship nyo. So always reiterate that and then find ways through it together. So to me, I would ask the manager in that conversation, manager, what do you think could we do together to help address this with the team? I'd love to talk about this with the team, but I would love your support. So sometimes we have to manage our managers and our leaders. We call it upward management sometimes. And it's really, they don't know what they don't know. And if we let them know what we're experiencing and we explicitly ask for support, then at least it's one step forward that will help. Okay. All right. So hopefully that helps you to give advice to your friend or to the person in the team that you are talking to. Okay, next question. We are a new company and we are having a hard time maintaining policy. How do we do that? Uh, some of it is culture. I can see why you have that question, but maybe it's more of ask yourself, where is the breakdown happening? Is it number one? Are people aware of the policy in the first place? Gaano ka clear ba yung policy? Is it easily accessible for them to know about and to see that policy? So try to see that as well. Number two, is it reinforced properly? Meaning, if people are not following the policy, are you consistent in applying the rules that will deal with those people? So think about that as well. When it comes to policy, the great thing about it is it's already written up, and ideally, it's something that the company already has different ways to manage whether you break that policy or if it's something you uphold, right? So I think that's the great thing about policy, and the way it affects culture is if you're not consistent with the policy that you're implementing, the culture becomes wala silang pakialam dun sa policy. So I think you have to do a little bit of searching there kung ano ba yung nangyayari. Is it number one, again, are people aware of the policy and clear ba siya? Or number two, is it being implemented consistently across all employees? Okay, next up, how could a company culture shift be implemented without offending or stepping on anyone? I get the intent of the question, right? Because you want to keep the peace, but honestly, the answer there is you cannot avoid upsetting some people. There's always going to be people who will have that reaction to change. So then you have to deal with that in different ways, right? You have to ask yourself, like, number one, find out what's making those complaints valid. Really get to the root of, okay, saan ba nanggagaling yung ganitong saan ba magagaling yung ganitong kinds of complaints nila? Maybe you can address those root causes. Or number two, the honest answer is, if the company is committed to the culture they're trying to shift towards, and there are people who are upset about that, then they self-select themselves out of the company, and that's okay. So sila na mismo yung aalis if hindi na aligned sa ugali nila yung nangyayari dun sa company. What you tolerate is what becomes the culture, right? So for example, if you say that we're moving into a culture where people will not be treated unfairly anymore. If you keep on promoting a manager who treats others unfairly, that's not going to shift the culture. But if you stay steadfast on really creating an environment that's rooted on fairness, then you're not going to promote that manager anymore until they change their behavior. If they don't change their behavior, maybe it's time to let them go, or they'll self-select themselves out. So yeah, very, very good question, I think. And honestly, I think there's no way to do change without upsetting some people. So that's just the reality of it. And then maybe from the perspective of if you're the HR person or the person doing the project, try to think that when people are upset, it's really an opportunity area for you to find out why they're upset and to do something about it. Okay. I'm getting some questions about the certificates. Hold on. So in the ranking, that just means you have to rank all of the items from 1 to 8. Hindi pwedeng nauulit yung ranking ng isang item. All right? Um, for questions about certificates from the past, we've already sent those way back. So you'll have to email us so we can find out more about what happened with your certificate. Okay. Okay. One last question. Quick check. Okay, yeah, one last question. So again, I see some people asking on Facebook about certificates. It's the link that I showed you earlier. It's tinyurl.com/hrspot-org culture, and it's open until 2 p.m. Okay. And one last question for today, everyone. What? Oh, second to the last. Hold on. No, they're kind of related. So let's address these questions together. So the question is, what if office gossip runs rampant, starting with the HR office? Same as the next question. So what if HR itself is the one questioning or not open to the changes? Okay. Honestly, I think this is one of the hardest things to address, because if HR doesn't model the things that you want to change, nothing's going to happen. So when it comes to gossiping, you have to be real with HR and say, eto ba yung gusto nating ginagawa natin? Or do we want to be the people who will push forward the new kinds of behaviors that we want to see? You have to have that talk, because collectively you have to decide what kind of HR professionals are we going to be for this company. Okay. Now, when it comes to um the the culture question, the HR manager treated one of her subordinates as a close friend, and when they are questioned on unjust and unfair ways, they treat this as character assassination, and they threaten the employee to file an admin case about it. If the HR manager is the one who's not cooperating, this is going to be so challenging. But honestly, one of the things you can do is to talk to the leader of the company, or sino yung boss pa ng HR manager na yon. Because if the leaders of the company are serious about culture change, and it's the HR leader who is not aligned, then they have to do something to either let that person go or set their foot down and say, if you don't change, then then nothing's going to happen. Something to think about is, when it comes to managing these leaders, we sometimes send them to executive coaching. So these leaders can use coaching as a tool to question their own thoughts, their own points of view. So that's one. Another way is, sometimes we send them to training on how to be an effective HR business partner or an effective HR manager. Because, I mean, look, the reality is not everyone in HR grew up at a time when HR is a strategic partner of the business, right? The reality is, HR as a strategic partner only became a thing maybe in the last 20-ish years or so. But before that, HR was really just used for admin work. And so there may be some HR leaders who don't have that sense of, how do I become a strategic partner, and so they feel like it's still an attack on them when people question the things they do. For these leaders, maybe they can't model the right behaviors because they don't even know what those behaviors are. So maybe think about what is happening with that HR manager. What support do they need to be able to relearn, unlearn some of their behaviors? So again, maybe they need some some support so they can learn about what are the skills needed as an HR manager. Maybe they could do executive coaching. And really, one of the best ways for you as an employee is to go to that person's leader, that person's boss, or a company leader who's higher up than that HR manager, and tell them what's currently happening and how that HR manager is treating the people around them. It's not easy answers, right? But hopefully, these are some ideas that can help you. What I hear from some people is when we talk about ideas like these, they don't even know it's possible. Sometimes some people will say, pwede po pala yun, pwede ko pala kausapin yung ibang leaders na hindi ko boss. Like that's something that I hope we can start to question that mindset. We can talk about the people in our companies, and hopefully that's a kind of culture that you'll start to try to build within your organizations as well. And everyone, I think that is it. I think we got all the questions. So thank you all so much for being here and spending time. We extended to answer questions, but that's usually how we do it here. For people who don't have questions, we let them go and then we just stay for extra questions. I think there's still 100 plus of us here. So thank you all so much for the questions. Very, very fun. Very hard topics, right? But that's why we're all here together, because we talk about them and we ideate on what are some approaches that you can do, whether it's big or small, simple or complex. And with that, I'm going to see you all in November. Please stay tuned. We'll announce more about Work as One over the next few weeks. And please have a great rest of your September. Have a great October. Enjoy your Burr months, everyone. And I'm going to see you in November. Have a great lunch. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you also. So nice to have you all here. All right. I'm going to end the meeting now. Enjoy your lunch, everyone.